I found my grandmother's antique violin, the one I'd spent 3 months restoring as a surprise inheritance gift for my dad, sitting in a dumpster behind his house, still in the presentation box I'd carefully wrapped. The note I'd written was crumpled beside it. Unread, I stood there for a moment, then pulled out my phone and called his business rival. Damien, it's Seraphina. I have something that might interest you. You're probably wondering how a 32-year-old woman ends up giving away a $250,000 inheritance to her father's competitors. How a single discarded gift leads to weeks of furious phone calls, threats, and a family war that changes everything forever. How the dutiful daughter becomes the architect of her own father's downfall. If you told me 6 months ago that I'd be sitting in my penthouse apartment in downtown Ashworth, systematically redistributing my late grandmother Evangeline's estate to every person my father had ever wronged in his 30-year business career, I would have thought you'd lost your mind. I was Seraphina Blackwell, the peacemaker, the one who showed up to every family gathering with homemade desserts, who remembered every birthday and anniversary, who spent her weekends driving 3 hours from the city to visit him in the small industrial town of Millhaven, where our family's manufacturing empire was built. I was the daughter who never asked for anything, who built her own successful career as a restoration specialist for rare musical instruments, while he bragged to his golf buddies about having a cultured daughter in the big city. The daughter who spent every holiday listening to his complaints about ungrateful business partners, disloyal employees, and competitors who didn't understand real craftsmanship like the Blackwell family did. But here's what I learned on that gray October morning, when I found my grandmother's 1847 violin buried under coffee grounds and takeout containers. Sometimes the people closest to you mistake your loyalty for weakness. They confuse your love with obligation. They assume that because you've always been there, you always will be, no matter how they treat you. My grandmother Evangeline Blackwell had been the heart of our family. She was the one who taught me about music, about art, about the difference between price and value. She was a violinist herself, classically trained at the Meridian Conservatory, before she married my grandfather Theodore, and helped him build Blackwell Industries into one of the most respected precision manufacturing companies in the tri-state area. When she passed away 8 months ago, she left behind a complicated will. The business went to my father Cornelius, as expected. The family estate in Millhaven, the investments, the stocks, all his. But she'd set aside specific items for me: her jewelry collection, her paintings, her books, and most importantly, her prized violin collection. 5 instruments, each worth between $30,000 and $80,000, accumulated over a lifetime of passionate collecting. The violin was the crown jewel, a mid-19th century French masterpiece, with a tone so pure it could make you weep. Grandmother had bought it at an estate auction in 1962, for what was then a fortune, but she always said it was worth every penny for the joy it brought her. When I was little, she'd let me hold it carefully while she explained the intricate woodwork, the delicate varnish, the way the sound holes were carved to create perfect acoustics. "This will be yours someday, little Sarah," she'd whisper, using her pet name for me. "But only if you promise to love it as much as I do." I did love it. Even though I'd chosen restoration over performance, even though my own musical training had taken a backseat to building my business, I understood the soul of that instrument. When I inherited it along with the other violins, I knew I couldn't just add it to my collection. It needed to be played, needed to sing again. That's when I had the idea. My father had always been bitter about music. He saw it as frivolous, impractical, a waste of time and money. It was one of the few things he and grandmother had disagreed about. She'd tried to get him interested in piano as a child, but he'd resisted, preferring to spend time in the factory with grandfather, learning the machinery business. Over the years, this had created a subtle tension. He respected her intellect and her role in building the family fortune, but he never understood her passion for the arts. After the funeral, during one of our regular Sunday dinners at his house in Millhaven, he'd made an offhand comment that stuck with me. "You know, Sarah, I always wondered if Mother would have been happier if she'd focused more on practical things, instead of all that music nonsense. Maybe she would have lived longer, if she hadn't spent so much time fussing over old instruments and concert programs. It was a cruel thing to say, but I could see the hurt behind it. He was grieving too, in his own clumsy way. That's when I decided I wanted to do something meaningful with the violin, something that would honor both of them, and maybe help heal that old wound. I spent the next 3 months researching the violin's history, having it professionally cleaned and restored by the best luthiers I knew in the business. I documented its provenance, its previous owners, its journey from a workshop in Maricourt, France, to my grandmother's loving hands. I had it professionally appraised, $78,000, even more than grandmother had estimated. But the real work was emotional. I wrote a detailed letter explaining the violin's significance, not just as a valuable instrument, but as a symbol of grandmother's passion and dedication. I talked about how she'd played it every Sunday after church, how it had filled their house with music for over 60 years, how it represented the artistic soul of the Blackwell family that he'd never fully appreciated. I wanted him to understand that this wasn't just about the money or the prestige of owning a rare instrument. This was about connecting with the part of his mother he'd never really known, the part that had fed her spirit and made her the remarkable woman who'd helped build everything he'd inherited. I had the violin professionally photographed, created a custom presentation case lined with midnight blue velvet, and included copies of all the historical documents I'd uncovered. I even found some of grandmother's old sheet music, pieces she'd annotated in her careful handwriting, little notes about tempo and feeling that showed how deeply she'd connected with each composition. The plan was to surprise him with it during his 65th birthday celebration. I'd drive down to Millhaven, present it during the family dinner, and explain how I wanted him to have it as a way of staying connected to grandmother's memory. Maybe he'd even learn to play it, or at least display it prominently in the house where it belonged. I imagined his surprise, maybe even gratitude. I thought about how this gesture might finally bridge that gap between us, help him see that grandmother's love of music wasn't frivolous, but profound. I thought it might be one of those rare moments when everything just clicked, when years of subtle tension dissolved into understanding. Looking back now, I realize how naive I was, how desperately I wanted to believe that my father was capable of the kind of emotional growth that would make such a gesture meaningful, how I'd convinced myself that his gruff exterior was protecting a softer heart that just needed the right key to unlock it. The weeks leading up to his birthday, I was genuinely excited. I'd call him every few days to check in, and I could barely contain my anticipation. He seemed pleased that I was planning to drive down for the celebration, even though he complained about the expense of the dinner reservations I'd made at Millhaven's fanciest restaurant. "You don't need to make such a fuss, Sarah," he'd say, but I could hear a note of pleasure in his voice. A simple dinner at home would be fine, but I wanted it to be special. I wanted the setting to match the significance of what I was giving him. I booked a private dining room at the Heritage Inn, invited his few close friends, even arranged for fresh flowers that matched grandmother's garden favorites. 3 days before his birthday, I loaded the violin case into my car along with an overnight bag, and made the familiar drive from Ashworth to Millhaven. The countryside was beautiful that time of year, all golden fields and bright autumn leaves, and I found myself humming one of grandmother's favorite pieces as I drove. I arrived at his house around 6 in the evening, planning to spend the night so we could drive to the restaurant together the next day. He greeted me at the door with his usual gruff affection, complaining about his back and the weather, and the neighbor's loud dog, but I could tell he was happy to see me. We had a quiet dinner together in his kitchen, just the two of us, and I almost gave him the violin then. But I held back, wanting to wait for the perfect moment at the restaurant when his friends would be there to witness it. I wanted him to feel proud, celebrated, surrounded by people who would understand the significance of what I was sharing. That night, I carefully placed the violin case in his study, hidden behind his desk where he wouldn't notice it but where I could easily retrieve it the next evening. I even rehearsed what I was going to say, how I would explain the restoration process, the historical research, the love that had gone into every detail. The birthday dinner was everything I'd hoped for. His old friend Marcus Redfield was there, along with Jonas Whitmore from the Rotary Club and a few other local businessmen who'd known our family for decades. Dad was in a good mood, telling stories about the early days of Blackwell Industries, accepting their praise and good wishes with the kind of satisfaction that comes from a life well lived. When dessert arrived, I excused myself and drove back to his house to get the violin. My heart was racing as I carefully lifted the case from its hiding spot and carried it back to the restaurant. This was it. This was the moment I'd been planning for months. I stood up at our table, case in hand, and cleared my throat. Dad, before we finish celebrating, I have something special for you, something that belonged to grandmother, but that I think she'd want you to have now. I placed the case on the table and opened it slowly, watching his face as the beautiful instrument was revealed. The violin seemed to glow under the restaurant's warm lighting, its rich amber varnish catching the light like honey. "This is grandmother's 1847 violin," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I've spent the last 3 months having it restored and researching its history. It's worth nearly $80,000, but its real value is in all the music she made with it, all the joy it brought her. I want you to have it, Dad. I want it to stay in the family home where it belongs." I handed him the letter I'd written, the one explaining everything I'd discovered about the violin's journey, about grandmother's connection to it, about why I thought it was important for him to have it. The table had gone quiet. Marcus and Jonas were leaning forward, clearly impressed by the instrument's obvious quality and value. I could see them looking between the violin and my father, waiting for his reaction. And that's when everything went wrong. Dad glanced at the violin, then at the letter, then back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. He didn't pick up the instrument or examine it closely. He didn't open the letter. He just sat there for a moment, and then he did something I'll never forget. He laughed. Not a pleased laugh, not a surprised laugh, but a harsh, dismissive sound that cut through the warm atmosphere of the restaurant like a knife. "Sera, what am I supposed to do with this thing?" he said, loud enough for the other diners to turn and look. "I can't play it. I don't want to learn. It's just going to sit around collecting dust like all of Mother's other musical junk." The word junk hit me like a physical blow. I felt my face flush hot, felt the careful composure I'd maintained throughout the evening start to crack. "Dad, it's not junk," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's a piece of family history. Grandmother loved this violin. She played it every day for 60 years. And now she's gone," he said with a shrug that broke my heart. "What good is a violin that nobody plays? What am I supposed to do? Hire someone to come dust it once a week?" Marcus cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Cornelius, it's a beautiful instrument. Very generous of Seraphina to—" "Oh, it's generous, all right," Dad interrupted, and there was something in his tone that made my stomach clench. "Very generous to give me something I never asked for, something that's just going to be a responsibility I don't need. You know what would be generous, Sera? If you'd asked me what I actually wanted before you went to all this trouble." I stared at him, unable to believe what I was hearing. I thought you'd appreciate the connection to grandmother. The history behind it." "History?" He picked up the letter I'd written and waved it dismissively. "This is just a lot of sentimental nonsense. Mother's dead, Sera. Keeping her old hobbies alive isn't going to bring her back." The silence at our table was deafening. I could feel the eyes of his friends on me, could see the mixture of embarrassment and pity in their expressions. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. This wasn't the reaction I'd spent months imagining. I carefully closed the violin case, my hands shaking slightly. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. "I thought you'd understand what this meant." "What I understand," Dad said, his voice getting louder, "is that you've spent God knows how much money getting an old violin fixed up that nobody in this family has any use for. You know what that money could have bought? Something practical, something useful." The drive back to his house was silent. I sat in the passenger seat with the violin case on my lap, trying to process what had just happened. When we got to the house, I mumbled something about being tired and went straight to the guest room, still carrying the violin. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene at the restaurant over and over again. The dismissive laugh, the casual cruelty of calling grandmother's treasured instrument junk, the complete inability to understand what I'd been trying to give him. But I told myself it was just shock, just his awkward way of dealing with unexpected emotions. Maybe in the morning, when he'd had time to think about it, he'd apologize. Maybe he'd ask to see the violin again, to read the letter properly, to understand what it really meant. I was wrong. The next morning, I found him in the kitchen reading his newspaper and drinking coffee like nothing had happened. When I tentatively brought up the violin, he just shrugged and said, "Take it back with you, Sarah." I meant what I said last night. I tried one more time to explain, to make him understand the research I'd done, the love that had gone into the restoration, the significance of keeping it in the family home. But he'd already moved on, was already talking about his plans for the day, dismissing my words like they were background noise. That's when I made a decision that I thought was gracious at the time, but now see as my final mistake. I left the violin. I carefully placed it back in his study, along with the letter and all the documentation I'd prepared. I told myself that he needed time, that eventually he'd come to appreciate what I'd given him, that maybe he'd even surprise me someday by learning to play it, or at least displaying it properly. "I'll leave it here," I told him as I packed my bag. "Maybe you'll change your mind." He didn't respond, just grunted and continued reading his paper. I drove back to Ashworth, feeling hollow, disappointed, but still hopeful that time would change his perspective. I called him a few days later to check in, but he didn't mention the violin. Neither did I. We fell back into our regular pattern of weekly phone calls and monthly visits, but something had shifted. I found myself making excuses to postpone trips to Millhaven, finding reasons to keep our conversations short. 2 months passed. I threw myself into work, taking on more restoration projects than usual, trying to distract myself from the disappointment. I told myself I'd done the right thing, that I'd honored grandmother's memory in the best way I knew how, even if Dad couldn't appreciate it yet. And then came that gray October morning that changed everything. I'd driven to Millhaven for what I thought would be a routine Sunday visit, but when I pulled up to Dad's house, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The garbage trucks were working the neighborhood, and sitting next to his trash cans was a familiar midnight blue case. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. There was no way my father would have thrown away a $78,000 violin. No way he would have discarded something I'd spent months restoring with such love and care. But as I got closer, there was no doubt. It was the vellum case, sitting in a puddle of coffee grounds and food scraps, one corner already stained by garbage juice. The beautiful presentation I'd so carefully prepared was ruined, the velvet liner damp and discolored. My hands were shaking as I opened the case. The violin was still there, but it had been carelessly tossed inside. The strings were loose, the bow was missing, and worst of all, there was a crack in the varnish near the fuhole that hadn't been there before. Someone had damaged it, either through carelessness or deliberate neglect. But it was the letter that broke me completely. My carefully written explanation of the violin's history, my heartfelt words about honoring grandmother's memory, my attempt to bridge the gap between us, it was crumpled into a ball and shoved into the corner of the case, stained with what looked like coffee or beer. He hadn't just rejected my gift. He hadn't just decided he didn't want it. He had literally thrown it away like garbage, without even the courtesy of calling to ask if I wanted it back. I stood there in his driveway, holding my grandmother's violin in its ruined case, and felt something inside me break. Not just disappointment this time, but something deeper. Something that had been holding me together for years, keeping me coming back, keeping me trying, keeping me believing that underneath his gruff exterior was a father who loved and appreciated his daughter. That morning, I finally understood that I had been living in a fantasy. The father I'd been trying to please, trying to connect with, trying to honor, that man didn't exist. The real Cornelius Blackwell was someone who could take a priceless family heirloom, a symbol of his mother's deepest passion, a gift restored with months of loving work, and throw it away without a second thought. And that's when I pulled out my phone and made the call that would change everything. Damien, it's Seraphina. I have something that might interest you. Because if my father thought my grandmother's legacy was garbage, if he thought the Blackwell family treasures were worthless, then I was going to make sure they went to people who would actually appreciate them. People like Damien Ashworth, owner of Ashworth Premium Manufacturing, my father's biggest competitor, and according to Dad's frequent rants, his most bitter enemy. People who understood the difference between price and value. People who would never throw away something precious just because they didn't understand it. Standing there in that driveway, holding that damaged violin, I made a decision that would destroy my relationship with my father forever. But for the first time in years, I felt completely, perfectly calm. Damien Ashworth answered on the second ring, his voice warm and slightly curious. We'd met exactly once, at a chamber music fundraiser in downtown Ashworth 2 years earlier, where he'd mentioned his appreciation for classical instruments and his regret that his own father had sold the family's antique piano during hard times in the 1980s. Seraphina, this is unexpected. How can I help you? I took a deep breath, still standing in my father's driveway with the ruined violin case at my feet. I know this might sound strange, but I remember you mentioning that you collect musical instruments. I have something that might interest you. A 1847 violin that needs a proper home. There was a pause. A violin? That's quite serious. May I ask how you came by it? It was my grandmother's. She passed away 8 months ago and left her collection to me. But I've realized I'd rather see this particular piece go to someone who would truly appreciate its craftsmanship and history. What I didn't tell him was that his appreciation would be the perfect middle finger to my father, who had spent countless dinners over the years complaining about Damien's pretentious success, his flashy downtown headquarters, and his unfair advantage in landing the premium manufacturing contracts that Dad felt belonged to Blackwell Industries. I'd be honored to take a look, Damien said. Would you like to bring it by my office tomorrow? Or I could come to you if that's more convenient. Your office would be perfect, I said, already planning my next move, say around 10 in the morning. After I hung up, I carefully retrieved the violin from its damaged case and examined it more closely. The crack in the varnish was worse than I'd initially thought. It would need professional repair again, but the instrument itself was still magnificent, still capable of producing the pure, haunting tones that had made grandmother weep with joy. I carried it inside my father's house, using my key to enter through the back door. The house was empty. He'd probably gone to his usual Sunday golf game, completely unaware that I'd discovered his cruelty. I found a soft blanket in the linen closet and carefully wrapped the violin, then placed it in my car. But I wasn't done exploring. I went to Dad's study, the same room where I'd hidden the violin case months earlier, and started looking around with new eyes. What else had he discarded? What other pieces of grandmother's legacy had he treated as worthless junk? That's when I found them. Hidden in the back of his closet, behind old business files and forgotten Christmas decorations, were 3 cardboard boxes labeled Mother's Music Crap in my father's harsh handwriting. Inside were treasures that made my heart race and my anger burn even hotter. Grandmother's sheet music collection, some of it original compositions from the 1940s and 50s, annotated in her careful handwriting. Her collection of rare classical recordings on vinyl, some of them limited pressings worth hundreds of dollars each. Her metronome, the same one she'd used to teach me rhythm when I was 7 years old. Her music stand, beautifully carved with floral details that matched the violin's decorative inlays. And most shocking of all, her personal journals, decades worth of thoughts, memories, and musical observations that should have been treasured family documents. Instead, they were crammed into a box like old magazines, some of them water-damaged from being stored improperly. I sat on his study floor, surrounded by these discarded pieces of our family's artistic soul, and felt my resolve crystallize into something harder than diamond. This wasn't just about the violin anymore. This was about years of dismissal, decades of contempt for anything that didn't fit his narrow definition of value. My father had spent his entire life believing that beauty was frivolous, that art was a waste of time, that anything that couldn't be measured in dollars and cents was worthless. He'd married a woman who loved music, and inherited a business built partly through her cultural connections and refined taste, and then spent 40 years dismissing everything she cared about as mother's music crap. Well, if it was crap to him, then I knew exactly what to do with it. I loaded all 3 boxes into my car, along with the violin. If Dad ever noticed they were missing from his closet, he'd probably assume he'd thrown them away and forgotten about it. After all, in his mind, they were just junk taking up space. The drive back to Ashworth gave me time to think, to plan, to let my anger transform into something more useful strategy. By the time I reached my penthouse apartment, I had a clear vision of what I was going to do. I was going to honor my grandmother's memory by making sure every piece of her collection went to people who would truly appreciate it. People who understood the difference between price and value. People who would display these treasures properly, care for them appropriately, and most importantly, people who would drive my father absolutely insane. Because I knew something about Cornelius Blackwell that he'd never realized I'd figured out. His greatest fear wasn't losing money or losing status. His greatest fear was being shown up, being made to look small and petty in front of the people whose respect he craved. And I was about to orchestrate the most public humiliation of his life. That evening, I sat at my dining room table with my laptop and a cup of tea, surrounded by grandmother's recovered treasures, and began making a list. Not just of the musical items I'd rescued, but of everyone in Millhaven who had earned my father's resentment over the years. There was Damien, of course, whose manufacturing company had recently won 3 major contracts that Dad had been sure were in the bag for Blackwell Industries. But there were others too, people I'd heard complained about during countless Sunday dinners, people whose success or happiness seemed to personally offend my father's sense of how the world should work. Isabella Rodriguez, the young entrepreneur who'd opened a high-end art gallery right across from Dad's favorite restaurant, specializing in local artists and classical music events. Dad had spent months fuming about her pretentious taste and predicting her business would fail within a year. Instead, she'd thrived, becoming one of Millhaven's most respected cultural leaders. Professor Marcus Whitfield, the retired music teacher from the local college who'd had the audacity to criticize Dad's proposal to cut funding for the town's arts programs. Dad had called him an ivory tower elitist and spent considerable effort trying to get him removed from the town council. Sarah Chen, the young violin prodigy who'd won a scholarship to study at the Meridian Conservatory, the same school where grandmother had trained. Dad had complained bitterly about wasting taxpayer money on music lessons when Sarah's story appeared in the local newspaper. And finally, the Millhaven Historical Society, run by a group of passionate volunteers who preserved the town's cultural heritage. Dad had spent years fighting their efforts to designate old buildings as historical landmarks, claiming they were standing in the way of progress and living in the past. Each of these people represented something my father couldn't understand or appreciate. Each of them would treasure the pieces of grandmother's collection that he'd treated as garbage. And each of them would serve as a living reminder of his failure to honor the woman who'd helped build everything he'd inherited. I opened a new document on my laptop and began typing, "Dear Damien, I hope you'll forgive the unconventional nature of this letter, but I find myself in the unique position of redistributing some family treasures to people who will truly appreciate them." By midnight, I had drafted 7 similar letters, each carefully personalized, each explaining the historical significance of the items I wanted to give away, each calculated to maximize both the recipient's joy and my father's eventual fury. But the violin would be first. The violin would be the opening move in a game my father didn't even know he was playing yet. As I finally headed to bed that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: genuine excitement about the future. Not the desperate hope of a daughter still trying to earn her father's love, but the quiet confidence of a woman who'd finally stopped caring about approval and started caring about justice. Tomorrow, I would walk into Damien Ashworth's office and hand him a $78,000 violin, and my father's week of rage calls would officially begin.